Greetings and salutations, everybody. Today I want to talk about Cuba because, as you may have heard, there's been a massive protest movement across the country. These are the first significant protests in decades because Cuba is a repressive communist regime that doesn't allow protests. And of course, this has brought out people in the United States that are simping for the communist regime, because this is what the left always does. They say when something's going wrong, that's not real socialism, or it's America's fault. So of course, our totally not communists in the alternative media, people who just want the Scandinavian model, are talking about how this is all due to America forcing food shortages. Now we're gonna get into this, but first we gotta hear from our sponsor, which is related to food shortages. Great transition. Friends, it seems like big government and tech giants are trying to destroy America. Everything they touch seems to end in disaster. Pretty soon, the whole system will fall apart, and the first thing that goes down in a crisis is the food system. Do you have enough emergency food for a crisis where the grocery shelves are empty? Most people don't, and that's why they panic when a crisis happens. The smart move is to lock in your emergency food supply right now. This is why I strongly recommend you guys head over to My Patriot Supply. They have over 41,000 4- and 5-star reviews, and that's because their products are excellent. And right now, since their mission is your survival, they're giving discounts as high as 25%. Go to preparewithajw.com, my special affiliate link in the pinned comment and in the top of the description, and order yourself an emergency food supply starter kit for you and everyone in your family or everyone that you care about. Again, that's preparewithajw.com, where you can get your emergency supply at an excellent price. So I'm sure you've seen videos and images of the Cuban protests. These people are waving our flag. They're demanding freedom. They're demanding COVID-19 vaccines. They're demanding more food. And of course, this has led a lot of people on the left to be uncomfortable because they are typically in favor of protests in theory, but they love communist dictatorships. Think of Bernie Sanders talking about how awesome Cuba was, which, by the way, great strategy by the Sanders campaign to do that right before the Florida Democratic primary. And I'm not being hyperbolic about this, and I'm not being hyperbolic about how widespread this is among the mainstream media. Get a load of this Reuters headline that I actually saw about how the Cuban protesters, the people protesting the communist regime, are actually going to exacerbate the COVID-19 pandemic. Funny how that works. If you're a Black Lives Matter rioter and you're aligned with Marxists and you're destroying private businesses, killing people, ruining people's lives because you're promoting a racial agenda that is anti-American, then all of a sudden you don't spread the virus. But if you're protesting Cuba under the threat of an actually authoritarian government, an actual communist nightmare hellscape, then all of a sudden you're spreading the virus. Funny how that works. Funny how the virus tends to have political affiliations, which is interesting because the Cuban government has totally botched this virus protection rollout. But that's just the hypocrisy that is the tip of the iceberg, because our totally not supportive of communist dictatorship friends Kyle Kulinski and Krystal also have their own hot takes about how the US is actually responsible for the suffering in Cuba. So let's hear about this from them.
So there's a number of things to say. First of all, if you watch his entire segment, he doesn't mention the U.S. embargo on Cuba once. He doesn't mention it. And I have to say, anybody who's talking about the issue of Cuba and they don't bring up the embargo, they're either incredibly ignorant on the facts, or they're stupid, or they're lying to you for ideological reasons.
All of those loudly screaming that we must do something to support the Cuban people, I completely agree. We should do the something that is directly in our power and purview, which is to immediately remove the brutal sanctions that have fueled shortages and are especially murders during a pandemic.
The protests were very clear. There's a shortage of food. There's a shortage of medical supplies. They want more food. They want more medical supplies. If the U.S. lifts the embargo, that would instantly help the people of Cuba. It's not an opinion. That's a fact. So to not bring that up and to pretend like, oh no, it's all just for, they're protesting for freedom and democracy. That's your interpretation when they said up front, immediately, the very first thing was shortage of food and shortage of medical supplies.
It's the embargo, you guys. The Americans are doing an embargo on Cuba, and that is causing all the problems within the Cuban government. It's not totally about the communism. Don't even talk about the communism. Ignore the communism. Ignore the people in Cuba that are also demanding freedom. No. It's all about the embargo. It's all about the United States strangling the Cubans off from food and prescription drug imports. Really, it is definitely true, and listen to Crystal Ball talk about how we have a solution to that problem.
We could also do something by lifting vaccine patent protections and helping supply vaccines to Cuba and everywhere else in the world, by the way. After all, it sure does take a lot of nerve for these people to pretend to rend their garments in agony over the plight of the Cuban people when they're all directly complicit in the suffering of that nation.
I want to break this down because I think it's incredibly important that we talk about this. Not recognizing patent laws is not going to increase the supply of vaccines. India is doing one of the worst jobs of any country in the world, and India notoriously does not recognize patent laws. And one of the funniest things about these lefties is they'll talk about how India is brave in standing up to Big Pharma in their non-recognition of patent laws, but then they'll also talk about how there's a shortage of vaccines in India because of those same patent laws. Again, these companies produce this with high-end technology that cannot be replicated by nations that seek to knock them off. On top of that, all of these people seem to be ignoring that Cuba is not being denied vaccines by the United States of America. In fact, the Cuban government themselves have refused the vaccines, and a couple of months ago, the mainstream media was celebrating this decision from the Cuban government. You have glorious headlines and articles about how Cuba is thumbing their nose at Big Pharma, how they refuse to join the COVAX program, which is a program by the World Health Organization to get vaccines out to third world countries that would have trouble affording them. And the reason why is because the Cuban government had decided that they were going to make their own vaccines. And not only were they going to do this, according to the mainstream media, and save their own population without Big Pharma, but they were also going to distribute those vaccines to other nations in the world for low cost or nearly free of charge, because that's how amazing the Cuban government was. All of a sudden, all those people who were cheering the Cuban government's decision months ago don't want to talk about it. They just want to talk about the US government embargoing vaccines when the US government is distinctly not embargoing vaccines from the Cuban government. They chose that for themselves, and these are the consequences of that. Also, it's really funny how all these people are anti-free trade. They call trading with third world countries exploitation of those third world countries. But now, because the US government won't trade with Cuba, aka they won't exploit Cuba, that's a huge problem. Also, again, this is not just the ideology of the idiot leftists in the United States of America. This is the ideology of the Cuban government. Remember what Krystal and Kyle said about how the embargo is limiting food and medicine into Cuba.
The protests were very clear. There's a shortage of food. There's a shortage of medical supplies. They want more food. They want more medical supplies. If the U.S. lifts the embargo, that would instantly help the people of Cuba. It's not an opinion. That's a fact.
Now, just to be clear, I am not somebody who blindly supports the embargo policy. We've been doing this for over 50 years, and it has not gotten rid of the Cuban regime. I'm for more effective policies in order to get rid of the Cuban regime. And one of the reasons why the embargo is not very effective against Cuba is because Cuba already tariffs heavily and taxes heavily imports of food and medicine and soap from other nations. And you don't have to take my word for it, because the president of Cuba has announced temporary lifting of those import taxes until December 31st, 2021 in response to the protests. So it's not the US government doing a Mac Jedi freaking mind trick on the Cuban government making them do that. They, like the left in this country, believe that international trade is exploitative, and in order to prop up their own industries, they heavily tax and restrict imports into their own country. We didn't trick them into doing that. That's something that the Cuban government did themselves, and that is far more responsible for the shortages, because the US embargo on Cuba is a US embargo on Cuba, but the restrictions on imports of food, medicine, and soaps and other hygiene supplies are restrictions that apply to anybody trying to bring supplies back into Cuba. So when Krystal and Kyle talk about the embargo as if it is the most important factor in what's going on in Cuba right now, and they talk about how the US government is preventing Cuba from getting vaccines, and how the US government is preventing Cuba from getting food, and how the US government is preventing Cuba from getting sanitation supplies, medicine, etc., that is just not the case. The Cuban government, based on their communist ideology of protecting their workers within their own country from competition from foreign nations, because remember, communists don't believe in free trade, are preventing or severely limiting those supplies from entering the nation. That's just the fact, but again, the simps for the communist regime don't want to tell you that because they support communism. I don't know how much more clear to make this. They are anti-American. And one of the worst things that I saw in Kyle Kulinski's video talking about this was Kyle referencing how the pro-government supporters in Cuba are even bigger, or at least as big, as the protests against the communist government of Cuba.
And by the way, Ben omits what? There are now pro-government protests that are just as big as the anti-government ones. But he omits that. So he's going to omit everything that doesn't fit his narrative. That's what Ben Shapiro does.
Now remember, the big premise of Kyle Kulinski's video where he's attacking Ben Shapiro for supposedly not disclosing that the American embargo on Cuba is causing all of these problems is the fact that Ben Shapiro is hiding information. You know what doesn't appear at all in Kyle Kulinski's video where he's sucking up to the Cuban dictatorship, to the Communist Party of Cuba? That the president of Cuba ordered Communist Party members to get out into the streets and fight back against the protesters. So yeah, the side that is being called to action by the Cuban government is marshaling their forces. The revolutionary side, the communists, and the military are coming out in force and attacking the people who are demanding a system that provides food, medicine, and all these other problems free of the communist dictatorship. So yeah, Kyle, really great job. Ben Shapiro is the one leaving stuff out, even though you have left out all of the key factors that have led to this crisis in Cuba. One of the left's absolute favorite phrases when referring to people on the right is they call something a mask-off moment. This Cuba situation is a mask-off moment for the left wing in the media and on the online media. They are supportive of communist dictatorships. If they see a problem in the world, they immediately look for a reason to blame the United States of America, and they will leave out every single crucial detail relating to the crises in order to highlight something that's basically irrelevant as long as they can tie it to the United States of America. The Cuban government, for the final time, tariffs food imports, not just from other nations, but from private people sending food to their families from other Latin American countries. The Cuban government tariffs medicine, they tariff hygiene supplies, and it was the Cuban government, not the United States government, that refused vaccines from Big Pharma because they believed that they would be able to produce the vaccines better and distribute them to Latin America because they thought it was a big propaganda win. They wanted to take it to Big Pharma, and the consequences of these actions are seen in the streets in the nation of Cuba. The denial about the basic facts that Cuba sucks because of communism, that socialism makes places worse, not better, is indicative of the denier rather than indicative of reality. But hey, those are just my thoughts, and they happen to be 100% accurate and factually based. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you disagree with me, I'll be happy to laugh at you. For those of you who like the video, you can show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via the support links. This has been me talking about the left wing sucking up to Cuba because they are communists. Till next time.